it's Katie at Quilt Beginnings, and welcome back to month 7 of the Bejeweled Block of the Month program. So this month we are going to be doing another pieced border. We're going to be working on these blocks out here. So we got one on this side and one set on this side. These borders are just made up of 2 different blocks, so 2 different colorways, but they're put together exactly the same way. So on one set, we've got kind of blues and greens, and then the next set is going to be purples and pinks. And depending on kind of how we orient them when we put them together, that's how we get this really nice chain effect as we go through the quilt. So this is a little bit smaller scale than a lot of the blocks we've worked on. We're going to be doing 4 patches as opposed to 9 patches, and we'll be doing some half square triangles. So let's go over to the work area and get started. All right, so this month we are using quite a few of our fabrics. In fact, just about everything except for our border fabrics. So I have everything pulled out here. I've already cut these sort of off of my bolt, off of the stash of fabric that I have. So we have a 2/3 yard cut of our background fabric. We've got 3/8 of a yard of our fabric E. This is going to go with our background for our half square triangles. And then I've got my nice deep blue of my fabric Q and my fabric C, or fat 8ths. And then everything else is going to be a fat 16th. So fat 16ths, because they are basically 4.5 inches, and then the fold is cut off, all of these, just about, I already had a leftover fat 16th in my stash from previous months, but we're basically using the other half of those fat 16ths. And then I'm going to be walking you through how to use triangle paper. So when I make half square triangles, I really think that triangle paper is just going to make it a lot easier. What I appreciate about Wilmington is that in their instructions, they tell us exactly how to cut to size. So if you are not going to be using triangle paper, I do appreciate that they give you the exact size that you need for your correctly finished triangles. But I think that half square triangles are just a lot easier when you're doing a lot of one set. They're just a lot easier with triangle paper. So we will walk through some of that. I'm going to be giving you this month an actual tips sheet because my cutting instructions are a little bit different. I just find that it's a little bit more efficient to strip piece some of these 4 patches rather than cutting all of these itty bitty squares. So in order to get started, move some of these aside, we're going to start with our background fabric. And I would say go ahead and give your fabrics a press. They have been, if you're like me, they've kind of been in your stash for some time. So it's always nice to give them a press before we start our cutting. All right, so my fabric A is nice and pressed. And I always kind of start with my cleaning cut. And then we're going to be doing, again, a little bit different than what the original instructions called for. So once I do my cleaning cut, and I'm going to have all this in the tips sheet for this month. Because we're doing triangle paper, let me just sort of show you, we are basically going to be doing sort of basic paper piecing. And so we need to be able to fit this paper on our fabric. And so we really just need about 6 inches in order to use my 2.5-inch my 2-inch finished half square triangle paper, my triangles on a roll. So I'm just going to be cutting 6-inch strips from my background fabric. And you can almost get as much as you need out of just one width of fabric cut. We do need about 8 extra triangles. So I'm going to cut 2 6-inch strips in order to fit them on my triangle paper. And then I find it really unwieldy to do triangles on a roll with a full width of fabric. So I do like to cut off my fold. And that way, when I go to actually put together my triangles on a roll, I just have a little more manageable piece to work with. So we're going to set those aside for now. And then everything that's remaining is going to be 1.5-inch strips. Okay, so if we look at our instructions, fabrics G, H, I, J, L, M, N, O, P, and R, as well as K, are basically going to be going into our 4 patches. These are the ones that we need 8 of each of them. And so we need 8 4 patches that involve 1 each of our G through R, and then fabric K does show up in 2 of our 4 patches. But basically we are going to be pairing 1.5 inch strips of our background fabric with 1.5 inch strips of each of those colored fabrics. So I'm going to go ahead and first cut 4 1.5 inch strips. And ultimately for each of these 4 patches, because we need 8 of each color combination. So we are doing pairs, we will be sewing pairs like R and A together. And we are going to need 8 pairs of R and A, 8 1.5 inch pairs, which means we need 12 inches total of R and A. So I don't like to cut myself, exactly where I need. I like to have a little bit of extra. And because of that, I'm going to be cutting these strips into 14-inch subcuts. And just bear with me, it will kind of make sense as we go. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off my selvage. Whoops. And then we want to come up 14. So we're going to come over 14 inches. So now I've got 8 1.5 by 14 inch strips here. And these, when I open them up, will be a little longer. These ones are 15, but they'll be kind of exactly what I need to do my strip piecing. So you should have 12 strips total that are roughly 14 to 15 inches, and this is going to make it much quicker and easier than sewing all our little squares together. The last thing I'm going to cut for my background fabric will be for my C and Q, my 32 C and Q 4-patch units. And so these are also going to be 1.5 inch strips. And for these, I just need 3 1.5 inch strips. And I love this Creative Grids ruler with the half inch mark. All right, so there's all my scraps. So then for these, they will be paired with half strips from my C and my Q fabrics. So I'm going to go ahead and just cut off the fold. So I end up with 6 1.5 by 20 inch strips for my C and my Q 4 patches. So just to recap from the background fabric, I've got 4 6-inch by 20-inch pieces. I have 12 of my 1.5 by 14 or 15 inches, and then I've got 6 of my 1.5 by 20-inch pieces for my C and my Q 4 patches. So let's cut the other fabrics to go with each of these. All right, so these are all of the rest of our colors that will be going into the 4 patches. So I've got G through R, basically all my fat 16ths, and then Q and C. And we're going to be doing 1.5 inch strips of each of these. So I'd say press them, stack them, and cut 1.5 inch strips. We are going to need 1 1.5 inch strip from G, H, I, J, L, M, N, O, P, and R. We'll need 2 from fabric K, and we'll need 3 from Q and C. So all of these are cut down to 20 or 21 inches already. So these will be 1.5 by 20 to 21 inches. And again, 1 from kind of the big group, 2 from fabric K, and then 3 from fabrics C and Q. All right, so this is all of the fabrics for block 6A, other than my C and my Q, which are my repeated 4 patches. But the last thing I'm going to do with these is cut them down to 14 inches, 14 to 15 inches. Make sure that your selvages are not included in that. So we really want about 14 usable inches in order to pair with our background fabric. Now remember, you only need 12 inches, so this is going to allow room for any messy sewing or just any sort of wiggling at the end. It's going to leave us some wiggle room. So next, and this is where the magic comes in, we are going to be sewing our background strips to our colored strips. And we're going to go through this entire stack and stitch them all together. I find strip piecing to be much more satisfying than sewing 160 little squares together. So when I strip piece, we're just going to sew 1/4 inch along the edge. And we'll do that for our entire stack of 1.5 inch strips. Isn't that faster than sewing all of these squares together? So once I have all my strips sewn together, I just snip them apart, and I'll be pressing everything towards the dark fabric. And I'm only working on the strips for block 6A at this time. You can work on them, 6A and then 6B, but this is exactly the same process that you'll be doing for your pinks and your purples as well. Once we've got them all trimmed, just press towards the dark fabric. So one thing that is really nice about making multiples of the same 4-patch is that I know that my fabrics are always going to be paired with the same ones. So I have my H and my K together, my G and my R, and then my J and my I. So before I go ahead and cut, I actually can nest my strips together. And then when I cut these, they are going to be all set up so that I can just go to my machine and chain piece very, very quickly and efficiently. So I'm just going to line up all of my strips. And you can really feel the seams. You're going to want to just butt them up against each other. There we go. It might take a little bit of finessing, but they do really want to seat together nicely. And we can actually cut all of these at once. I'm going to sort of bring them down. And remember, you only need about 12 usable inches. So I would look at your ruler and or look at your mat and just make sure that you are kind of right, that your 12 inches is fully usable and that everything's lined up as you need it before I go ahead and cut. So I'm going to make my cleaning cut to cut off all of my scrap ends. And again, I'm just checking. So I'm at 12.5 inches on my ruler. I'm going to look up to 24.5, and I am safe on that end. So I'm good to go. And I'm going to cut 8 1.5 inch cuts. All right, so I've got my scraps on the end. Oops, and these two kind of came apart. But otherwise, I am ready to just stack my pairs and take them to my machine, and I'll have 3 little piles to stitch to finish my 4 patches. So this method makes it so easy to chain piece my 4 patches together. So I can just feed in my 4 patches, my seams are already all lined up and butted up, and I can make pretty quick work of these 4 patches. So stitch them all together. All right, so now that we have our 4 patches done of our 8s of each of those, now we're going to come back to our C's and our Q's. So for these, I've got 20-inch strips. You should have 3 20-inch strips of each of these fabrics, and they, just like before, are going to pair this time with the 20-inch strips of the background fabric. So go ahead and strip piece your 20-inch strips, and then we're going to do the exact same thing where you stack them up and you cut them down to 1.5 inches all together. Okay, so we have all of our 4 patches done. Part of the reason why we had to have 20 inches for our C's and our Q's is because each block is going to take 2 of those 4 patches. But you can see the missing pieces is our half square triangles. So let's get to our half square triangles and look at triangles on a roll. All right, so for our half square triangles, for our triangle paper, we have already cut our 6-inch wide fabric from our background. I cut on the fold because with triangle paper, it's really unwieldy to have more than about 20 inches to stitch on. So just make sure that you are right sides together. So with the background fabric, you always kind of have to double check which way is the right side. And then I've also got a 6-inch wide piece of my fabric E. I'm going to lay the triangle paper on top. And here, my background fabric is a little bit skinnier than my fabric E. I was a little more of a rough cut with my fabric E. So I'm going to put the skinnier fabric on top so I can be sure that I'm always within the lines. All right, and then I do like to straight pin in between. So with triangle paper, I'm going to be stitching on the dotted lines and then cutting on all of the solid lines. So I do find it helpful to pin, and you just want to make sure that you avoid any of the dotted lines because that is where we're going to be sewing, and we don't want to run over a pin or have to take one out. So I'm just going to put a few pins in. All right, we should be good to go to our machine and start stitching this out. All right, so whenever I stitch on triangle paper, we are going to be actually ripping the paper off, and so we want our seam to be a little bit extra reinforced. So I like to lower my stitch length down to 2, around 2. Normally 2.5 is good when we're just piecing, but this is nice to have a little bit closer perforation. So 2 is good for a stitch setting. And then I also like to be sure that my needle stops in the down position. And if you have a pivot function where when your needle stops down, your foot pops up, that is very helpful because when you get to the end, you're going to want to pivot and keep on sewing. So we're just going to pick a dotted line and we're going to sew on every one of them. And it's kind of like following a labyrinth. So you just sort of follow the arrows around and you keep going until you get them all. When I get to the end of one row, I'm often, here we're not able to go all the way to the point, so you just sort of stitch over till you're at the beginning of a new dotted row, and you can ease it in and then stitch straight along the next dotted line. All right, when I get to the end, I just kind of like to double check. Of course, I used a white bobbin here, so it's hard to see. But I just like to double check that I've got all my X's, that nothing's sort of missing in terms of my stitching. So you can kind of see it as it catches the light there. Again, just sort of double checking that I've got all of my dotted lines stitched on, and then we'll go to the mat and cut them apart. All right, so just like I don't want to run over a pin when I'm sewing, I definitely don't want to run over one when I'm cutting. So go ahead and take out all your pins. And then we're going to cut on every solid line, including around the outside edge. Once they're all cut, this is my favorite part. You just rip the paper off. Comes off nice and easy. So you'll be making 64 of these half square triangles. I just did one sheet here for an example. I like to once again press towards the dark. And then snip off my dog ears. And with this method, you have perfect half square triangles that just come together a lot more quickly and efficiently than cutting the half squares and then trying to sew them back together again. I love this method for making half square triangles. All right, so here are our half square triangles. I just have to pay careful attention every time we lay these out. So for block 6A, I will be making 8 identical blocks. So I would take your whole stack of your 4 patches of each of these different combinations and just make a stack of 8 deep of these identical blocks. So your half square triangles are pointing in towards each other, and just kind of paying careful attention to where like your fabric I is here, your fabric Q. They do spell out on the diagram where one fabric from each 4 patches, so make sure they're sort of all in order. And we'll be assembling this just like a 9 patch, which we've done many times before. So I like to sew them in rows and then stitch those rows together, and we'll have our completed block. So for this 9 patch, I pressed my top row to the right, and then to the left, and then to the right. As long as your seams are opposing each other, you should be good. And there it is. So here's our completed block. Again, you're making 8 of these and then 8 of the other colorway. So these will be making up our pieced border. And next month, we are going to be putting everything together. So we'll be stitching these together, assembling our pieced borders, and then putting all of the borders on for the really neat kind of finishing layout on this quilt. So congrats on getting through month 7 on finishing your last pieced block. And again, next month we're going to be doing borders, and we're going to be kind of putting the finishing touch on this quilt. So see you then.